What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to this episode of Home Built Workshop. Today we are going to restore a Stanley No. 4 hand plane that I picked up all rusty and crusty in an antique shop and turned into this. A nice, awesome looking, usable plane. Check it out. So I recently picked up this cool Stanley No. 4 hand plane. I thought this would make a really awesome project because it does need a complete restoration, but I also thought this would be kind of fun because the tote is missing, as well as the bolt and the brass nut that goes to the top. I thought it would be kind of cool if we make a new tote as well as restore this. Now originally I thought I could just get a new nut and a new bolt for this, make a new tote and be done, but I found that Stanley no longer sells these replacement parts. They've discontinued them. I contacted Stanley directly and that's what they told me. So I put out my call to help to you guys in one of my weekly live streams, and Scott responded to my call to help. Scott had one of these things and he offered to ship it to me to use for this restoration. Scott, thank you so much, buddy. I so appreciate this. It fits perfectly. We're gonna get on to this restoration right now. I'll start out by cutting down a piece of sapele that I'll use to make the new tote. The reason I'm starting with the tote is because I need it in place to move ahead with the flattening process. I'm using a template that Lee Valley has made available on their website. I'll put a link below in the description. Now I'm just gonna use a little bit of spray adhesive to attach my template to my blank. This template has all kinds of center lines and markings and measurements on here, pretty much everything you are going to need. All we need to do is transfer a few marks to our blank and we can start making some cuts. With our marks transferred, first we're going to drill this through hole, which is where the threaded rod and the brass nut are going to go. Now to make this a little bit easier, I'm going to drill part way from one side, part way from the other side, and hope they meet in the middle. First I'm going to drill the recess for the brass nut, according to the size and depth noted on the template. Then I'll switch to the smaller drill bit and drill all the way through. Ah, there it is. It worked. So now we're going to cut this angle right here. That is going to orient the grain kind of on a diagonal. That's going to make sure that there's no areas that have really thin grain, and it should help minimize any breaking. Once we have that cut, we're going to transfer this counter bore to the bottom face, and then we're going to drill that little counter bore as well as this little recess right here for that little tab at the front of the handle. Now I'm using my bandsaw to make this cut, but a handsaw would work equally as well and it'd be really easy to do. I'm going to sand that surface nice and flat on my belt grinder, but as long as you get it flat, use whatever method works for you. And it's back to the drill press to drill the recesses in the bottom of the tote. All of the sizes that you're going to need, as well as the depths, are indicated on this template. Now I am ready to rough out this shape. First, I want to take care of these two sharper radiuses. There's some sizes indicated on the template that I can drill these out with a Forstner bit. I'm going to use a nice sharp awl to mark the center point of those circles. Sometimes if you're having trouble lining up the point on your drill bit with the center punched hole that you've marked, you can pick the piece up, and if you wiggle it around until it finds the hole, then you can bring the drill bit down and you know it's aligned. And it looks like I probably could have used a little bit more spray glue. The template really only came up in this area. The rest of it was still stuck pretty well, so I wasn't too concerned. Now I can finish cutting out the tote. I'm going to use my bandsaw, but again, you can use whatever method you have, whether it's a handsaw, a scroll saw, coping saw, whatever works and helps you get the job done. So now we are ready to move on to the fun part, and that is the shaping of this blank. Let's get this thing shaped down. I'm going to use a combination of rasps and files and sandpaper, whatever I need to use to get this thing shaped. I think I'm going to start out clamping this in a hand screw clamp that I can then secure in my bench vise to do all the shaping. The template provides a lot of information for this, but there is no information for shaping, and this is the cool part because you can shape this to whatever's comfortable for you. If you want it more rounded, make it more rounded. If you like more of a squared feel, leave it more square. Whatever feels nice for you, go with it. Now we're getting somewhere. Well, after a whole lot of sanding, I probably got just a little bit more sanding to do before I actually put any finish on there, but right now I'm going to get this thing installed so that I can move on with the rest of this restoration. And that fits really good. I like it. Now that I can actually hold on to this thing, we can move on with getting this sole flattened and the sides cleaned up. Now for the remainder of this restoration, I'm going to be using a lot of the same tips and tricks outlined by Paul Sellers in his video on hand plane restorations. I'll put a link down below in the video description if you want to check that out. Paul is an awesome teacher and a wealth of knowledge. I definitely recommend checking him out. If you want to use other methods to restore your tools, by all means go for it. You don't have to use this method. Now I personally like this method because it is all manual work. You're not using any machines, grinders, or anything like that. Now, I've seen some people get amazing results using machines like that, and if that works for you, by all means, go for it. But I think after spending the time and the hard work sanding and cleaning everything by hand, you're going to feel a lot more connection to the tool, and that's what I'm all about for this method. Before I do anything with any flattening, I'm making sure that I have the blade backed way inside the mouth of the plane. I don't want to hit that with any sandpaper in our next step. To begin the flattening process, I'm going to apply some sticky back sandpaper to both sides of my nice flat sanding beam. If you don't have PSA paper, you can definitely use super glue and masking tape to create your own double-sided tape. One side of this is going to get 150 grit, the other side is going to get 220. So now with everything in place and locked down, the plane has the same pressures exerted on it that's going to have when it's actually being put to use. Now we can begin to flatten this, starting off on this 150 grit. I'm not really applying a lot of pressure here, just a nice even pressure as I start to sand away the rust. At first we get a whole lot of rust, so I want to try to keep that paper cleaned off. Don't want it to load up with rust. You can start to see a little bit of action going on here. So it looks like it's got a pretty good dish in the center. Might take a little bit of work to get that out. As I discovered here, there really is no shortcut to getting this thing nice and flat. It's really all about taking your time and keeping at it. Eventually you'll get there. It is hard work though. That actually ended up being a lot of work. There was a really stubborn patch there. You can still see maybe a little bit. Not worried about getting the entire thing completely down, but the sandpaper has touched the entire surface. There's just a couple little deeper areas, but they're back here, so I don't think it's going to make any difference. So now I'm going to flip my beam over, make a few passes on this side with the 220. So now that I have this whole area flat, now I want to put just a teensy tiny bevel on the ends. That's going to help it when it glides over uneven surfaces while I'm using this thing. To do that, I have a steel ruler that's just a little bit thicker than the sandpaper. I'm just going to place it along the edge of the sandpaper and make just a couple of passes with one edge of the hand plane on the ruler. And I can see that it's only sanded just a little bit on the end, so putting the tiniest ever micro bevel on the very edge. So that takes care of the bottom of the plane. Now I'm going to work on cleaning up the sides. I'm going to use the same method. I'll flip this back over to my 150 grit sandpaper, and we're going to do the same thing with both sides of this. Now all this sanding and leveling makes the edges nice and sharp. Now for a hand plane, we don't want sharp edges because those are spots that could dig into your work. So we're going to use a flat file and just lightly break all the corners. Then we'll make a few more passes on the sandpaper, rolling the plane on the corner to lightly round over the edge. Now with it very lightly clamped in my vise, I'm going to round off these corners as well as put a small bevel on this edge. Now this plain sole is pretty hard, so I want to make sure you have a nice sharp file. Now just like the previous step, the goal here is to remove any sharp corners that could potentially gouge or scratch your workpiece. At first this seems a little intimidating taking a file to your hand plane, but really all we're touching is the corner. You're not affecting the performance of the tool at all. So now I'm at the point where I can take the rest of this thing apart and we can work on the frog, the blade, chip breaker, all that sort of pieces, getting everything else cleaned up and fitting together nicely. I'm just going to take this thing down completely. And there you go. There's our plane body. There's a lot of chips and gunk and some rust and stuff in there. I want to work on cleaning those up. I'm not cleaning this up to where I'm going to repaint this or anything, but I do want to clean it up, get rid of the rust, and make this a really nice, usable tool. I'll start out just by using a brass wire brush just to get in there and start to knock off all the loose particles. On the back of the frog, I'm really just cleaning up the couple points of contact to make sure there's no rust and I get a good solid mounting point in the bottom of the plane. But on the back side, I want to clean up these areas and try to flatten them as best as I can. Now this adjustment lever is kind of in the way, so we kind of have to work around that, but I think we can make that work using our sanding beam. I ended up using my sanding beam in a couple different angles to best work around the adjustment lever. This sanding beam that I'm using is homemade. A good alternative would be to just cut some nice flat strips of wood and use them as sanding blocks. So we are now at the point where really all that's left to do is just clean up the rest of these parts. You could have cleaned everything up to begin with, but then once you got into flattening, if you found that the sole was really not flat or you couldn't salvage it for some reason, well then you've just spent a lot of time in the other pieces cleaning them up and all that. But now this sole is nice and flat, it's ready to go. Now I know that all I need to do is just clean up the rest of the parts. So now is a good point to put on a podcast, put on some tunes, whatever it is. I'm gonna put on a respirator because I don't wanna breathe all of that rusty dust that gets in the air. Go to town using some sandpaper, just cleaning up all the edges, cleaning up all the pieces, getting everything ready to go. So let's do this. Just like flattening the sole, this part takes some time. You just need to be patient and keep working. Our goal here is to get all the rust off the piece, and it's just gonna take a while. Now at what level you want to stop is entirely up to you. If you want your plane to have a mirror polish, by all means, go for it. I'm stopping at about 400 grit sandpaper. Wow, that was actually quite a lot of work. There is still one final piece that I need to clean up, and that's this lever cap. Now I don't want to just sand it because I don't want to leave scratches on the top. The thing's going to be really visible, so I'm going to try to buff that out with my homemade shop buffer. This is really the only point in the whole cleanup process where I'm using a machine. I felt that this would give me the best finish and also be the safest option for this part. That actually worked out really well. There's still a few pock marks and things on there from where there was some rust and corrosion, but I think this is going to look really awesome. Before I can put it back together, I now need to flatten the back of this and give this blade a quick sharpening. Now I know there's a lot of different methods that people use for sharpening a hand plane, and you can use whatever method works for you. Here I'm using a honing guide. I've had pretty good luck with these. So after sharpening this blade to 2000 grit, it's getting a nice shine on there and it feels really sharp. We're gonna step it up just a tiny bit more. We're gonna make a few passes on this leather strop. If you wanna see how I made this leather strop, I'm gonna put a link below in the description. It's a really simple project, but it is invaluable when you're sharpening everything from hand planes to kitchen knives, all sorts of things you can sharpen on a strop. The last thing that I need to do is spend a little bit of time on this front knob. Now there's nothing really wrong with it. It's not chipped, cracked, broken, or anything. I could just put it back on, but the finish is flaking off. So before I start sanding, I'm going to use a tip that I picked up from Paul Sellers' video, and that's to take a chisel and you can actually use the side of it to scrape off the flaking finish. Actually seems to work pretty good. At least it gets the kind of the larger pieces off of there. Now I suppose you wouldn't necessarily have to use a chisel, but anything with a nice sharp point, you could maybe even use a knife. Once I have the majority of the finish scraped off, I'll just start sanding the knob and the rear tote in preparation for the finish. For the finish, I'm going to keep it super simple. These guys are just going to get a nice bath in some boiled linseed oil. Since these pieces have the holes where the bolt goes, I thought it would be easier to get the oil into that hole by giving them a bath. Oh, look at that color. That's cool. Well, now I have all the parts here. Everything is ready to go back together. The boiled linseed oil is dry on the handles. Let's go ahead and reassemble this. I'm applying some light oil to all the surfaces where anything meets, slides, adjusts, any of that sort of thing. I want to make sure everything moves nice and freely as I'm putting this back together. You don't need it sopping in oil, just a little bit to protect some of the surfaces. Too much oil, you're going to start collecting dirt and dust and shavings and that sort of thing. That'll just make it a mess again. Once I've oiled the adjustment knob, I'm going to make sure to run it all the way down the threads and then back it back out to make sure that all of the threads have oil on them. As I get each piece oiled, I'll just start putting the parts back on the plane. All of the screws, I'm threading them down in as far as they'll go and then backing them out to where they need to be. This makes sure that you have oil in all of the threads and it doesn't rust on down where there's no screw. Last thing I'm going to oil up is this lever cap. Just want to make sure everything runs smoothly, as smooth as possible anyway. I've got just a little bit of oil on this rag. I'm just going to wipe down the outer surfaces just so we don't start getting any sort of surface rust. I am really liking how this looks. Let's try it out. So right now I've got the blade backed off. I get nothing. But as I slowly start to bring the blade down, I start to get some really nice shavings on this scrap of white oak. I am excited. Well, there it is, guys. There's my nicely restored Stanley number 4. I really like the way this thing looks. I think my other planes are going to be a little bit jealous, and I may need to start doing some cleanup on those as well. If you found this video at all helpful, go ahead and give it a big old thumbs up. Also, don't forget to click the subscribe button. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, as well as hit that notification bell so that you get notified when I post new videos. And as always, social media links, as well as some other links you might be interested in, are down below in the video description. Make sure you head on down there, check them out. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. We'll see you next time. Shake well before using. Social media links and a bunch of other stuff are down below in the comments. In the comments? Really? I mean, that lid anyway. Coffee. It's a lot earlier than I normally start. I usually don't start video really before I've been up for a little while and have time to wake up, but right now it's just a little bit after 6 o'clock in the morning. Trying to get a jump on this. I want to get this thing done today. What is that, an incoming plane?